subscribe and like. And tell your friends about this video.
My name is Bernard, but now no one calls me that. They say grandfather, or worse, they keep quiet, as if I were part of the interior, an extra chair in the kitchen that no one sits on. I live in a small, creaky house on the edge of town. I once built it myself from reddish bricks that I chose myself at the factory. Now this brick, like me, has faded. The sun does not shine through the windows, because the trees have grown taller and obscure everything. I rarely open the curtains. Why? Behind them is the same world that neglected me. My son Stas is a businessman just like I used to be. Successful, bald, with a new wife and a new voice. He speaks to me as if I were a fool. Slowly, contemptuously, through his lip. He calls once a month. But not to ask how I am, but to make sure that I am not dead yet. My granddaughter Lilia looks at her phone even when I say hello. She sits on my couch, drinks my tea, and has never once asked me how I sleep or what I dream about. My grandson Nikita once said to me, "Why are you always so gloomy, Grandpa? You smell of boredom." I didn't answer. After all, he's 15. He believes that life began with his Instagram. I wake up at 6 every day because that's what I'm used to. I used to get up before the sun to have time to open the office, meet clients, and check plans. Now I wash myself with cold water. Not because I like it, but because the boiler is rattling and calling a repairman makes no sense. As my son says, then I sit in the kitchen for a long time, looking out the window. Sometimes I count cars. I go to the store, the one closer to the road. The young girls at the checkout there don't say thank you. When I ask if there is yesterday's bread, they laugh. One once said, "But who needs it, yesterday's like you?" I wanted to answer something. Couldn't. Words like stuck nails don't come out. They hide deep between the ribs. I remain obediently silent. In the hospital, it's a different story. A doctor younger than my grandson looked at me over his glasses and said, "At your age, nothing strange. Fatigue is normal. You're not 20 years old." But I used to lift 200 kilograms of steel structures. I've endured betrayals, taxes, raiders, and now fatigue is my sentence. People see nothing in me except a bent back, trembling hands, and forgotten words. They pass by like an old billboard, with once important, now erased paint. I'm no longer a person. I'm a statistic. But there is one thing that remains mine. My memory. It is as clear as knives sharpened by years. I remember every look, every disdain, every silence after my hello, and something rotten is growing inside. Slowly, like mold. Not rage, not yet, but the resentment that no longer hurts. It bites. Turns me into something else. In the evenings, I often sit down at the old table. I write in a notebook. First, just give. When my grandson didn't show up for my birthday. When Stas lied about being busy. When the doctor raised his voice. Then names. I have never been vindictive. But the silence in which I was left. It is loud. And in this silence, something is born. I wasn't always a shadow. My voice used to be louder than thunder. And when I spoke, people listened. I remember the day I signed my first contract. It smelled of dampness. We were sitting in a cheap trailer barack, papers on our knees, a pen borrowed from an accountant. I remember how sweat was running down my neck. I was young, stubborn. I had a goal. To rise on my own, without asking, without stealing, without humiliating myself. I built a business brick by brick. I started with nothing. There was no money, no connections. There were only hands and my word. I held it firmly like a hammer. Back then, people still believed in honor, in authority, in dignity. If I said I would pay by Friday, even the banks waited until Friday. They respected me, and they were afraid. But not because I shouted. And because I never forgot. I lost a lot. Most of all, Elena, my wife. She was my silence. The only one who saw me not as a businessman, but as a person. She made tea in the morning and always turned the radio a little louder to drown out my thoughts. She died suddenly. The doctors said heart. And I know it was from loneliness. I was too busy, building and calculating everything. I didn't notice how she broke. After her death, I didn't cry. I just started getting up even earlier. I raised my children like buildings, strong, stable. But I probably forgot to add a soul to them. My son Stas was my project. I taught him to keep his word, to be tough, not to show weakness. He learned, maybe even better than me. But he became such a stranger. His gaze is now a mirror in which I am not reflected. I gave them everything: education, apartments, startup capital. I paid for their dreams without asking questions. And you know what I'm left with? A chair by the window, a sofa that no one chooses, and silence at the holiday table. There were years when I had a driver, a personal doctor, lunches with mayors, meetings in offices with leather chairs. Now I'm sitting in line to see a therapist, where they tell me that my blood pressure is age, not a problem. People used to stand up when I entered the room. Now they turn away. And what's worse, at home, my grandson is bored with me. He's better off on TikTok than with my stories about how I survived the 90s. And I didn't just survive, I fought. I paid with my body and nerves to give them a future. And now I'm a delay in the schedule. An old man who asks to turn the TV on. And then, at night, sitting in the dark, I open that same notebook. I started writing not only dates, but also memories. How we stood with Elena in an apartment without furniture, and were happy because there was light. How I once carried office equipment out of a burning building myself, because I didn't trust anyone else. How I kissed a child on the forehead before the first day of school. All of this was, and I gave myself to it. And they gave me to old age. The scariest thing is not death. The scariest thing is depreciation. When everything you built is erased. When you become a burden, a museum without visitors. But I'm not finished yet. Memory is my fortress. I know all their weaknesses, all the cracks in their perfect faces. I taught them to play, and now it's my turn. Every day now is like another. And in each one I die, little by little, in pieces, like a house whose plaster crumbles with every rain. A week ago I fell in my yard. I slipped on a damn wet leaf. Once I could lift a concrete beam, but now I couldn't lift myself. I lay there, 20 minutes. It was so quiet that even the neighbor's dog was silent. When I finally got up and entered the house, my hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was proud, because no one would have asked. The second time was worse. My son came for dinner. He brought Lilia, his granddaughter. They were talking to each other. I couldn't hear because my hearing aid was out of order again. I raised my head and said, "Stas, could you help me with the boiler?" "There's just..." "Dad, I'm busy. I already told you, call someone. I'm not a plumber." His voice was short, without a drop of sympathy. Lilia didn't even look up. She just flipped through the pages. That same day I wrote in my notebook, October 8th, Stas, refusal of help. Tone, irritated, indifferent, ice cold. Words like ice water. I didn't write about how I felt then, that I no longer mattered. I simply recorded the facts. A few days later I met my grandson Nikita near the store. He was walking with friends. I smiled, waved. He looked, and turned away. One of his friends whispered something to him, and they laughed. It wasn't laughter. It was a blow. Sharp, silent. I wrote, October 12th. Nikita. Ignoring. Mocking. Chest pain, not physical. At the clinic, the doctor didn't even look at me. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, without looking up from the monitor. My pulse is racing. It feels like something is pounding inside me, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. "It's normal at your age. What, do you want to be examined as a young person? There won't be enough resources for you." His words sounded like I was a burden on the state. I didn't answer. I just left, and wrote, October 14th. Doctor. Cynicism. Contempt. The phrase, "There won't be enough resources." Remember, that notebook is my time computer. I record everything. Their words, dates, faces, even the color of their shirts. Because every little thing like that is like a nail in the coffin of my naivety. And then the day came that changed everything. I was carrying 2 packages, heavy ones, because someone in the house has to buy bread, cereals, soap. I was standing near the underpass and then I couldn't hold one of the packages. Fell, the groceries rolled out. I knelt down and tried to pick them up. People were walking by. Young, strong. 2 young men passed by, laughing and said, "Grandpa, lie down now, don't be upset. You'll die anyway." Their laughter rang in my ears for a long time. Someone else said something else, I couldn't make it out. I sat in the middle of the passage, like a rag, with scattered pasta and an empty heart. Something clicked. Inside. It wasn't anger. Not pain. It was a silent insight. Dark, cold, clear. I got up. Slowly. I took everything I could. And went home. But I was no longer the same person who had left the house in the morning. Now the person I had kept locked away all my life had taken up residence in me. In the evening, I took out an old cigar, the one I had saved for a special day. And I didn't light it. I just held it in my hands. I looked like a lamp shadow sliding down a wall. Silence was no longer a void. It had become a companion, an accomplice, a witness to the birth of my plan. I will not shout. I will not cry. I will not beg. I will play. And this game will be flawless. Every move is like the old negotiations. Only now, instead of contracts, dates. Instead of a pen, memories. And instead of a signature, a final action. I can still see that day. It lies within me, like a scar under my skin that never heals. The sun that morning was pale, like a face in a mirror. I walked to the store slowly, my hands still remembering the weight of the bags. My steps careful not to stumble upon what seemed foreign. A world where I had become superfluous. The underpass under the bridge was cold, and it smelled of damp stone and the remains of late dinners. I lifted the bags and one of the straps jerked. The plastic bags made a sound, like bread breaking in two. They fell. I folded, bent at the waist, like that old chair that had long been cracking. Everything around me folded, and time seemed to stop, and people became nothing more than shapes. A few meters, and there was a store, a cash register, a check, light, the smell of coffee. But between me and that world, an abyss. I got up on one knee and began to gather. A can of canned food, bread, a bag of pasta, some wet wipes. My hand trembled, not from the cold, but from the fact that a lump had grown in my stomach that wouldn't let go. They walked past without looking. 2 young boys, already with the audacity of adults, taught by their indifference. One subtly twisted his arm, as if to push me even harder. The other, in a voice that didn't even deserve attention, whispered, "Look, Grandpa's fallen." Who would have guessed he was still alive? And everyone around them laughed like birds that weigh nothing. I saw their smiles cutting the air. I wanted to stand up and shout for them to shut up, for one of them to stop and look me in the eye. But I don't know how to shout. I learned to speak quietly so that words would have weight. And that's when silence became a friend. I got up, gathered what I could salvage, and tucked a package of bread under my arm. And I felt strongly that it wasn't just the packages that had fallen. All my faith in the people who had once called themselves mine had fallen. I went home, and a plan slowly crystallized in my head. It wasn't impulsive rage. No, it was a cold clarity, like morning frost. You see every crumb on the window, every brown line on the glass, and it shows no mercy. I felt someone else, not quite me, waking up inside, careful, methodical, ruthless in its precision. That evening I didn't cry. I took out of the drawer the notebook that had kept my order all my life. Dates, bills, numbers. But the last pages became a black and white map of my resentment. I took out another notebook, a thin one like a diary of negotiations, and began to write. Not addresses, not contacts, but dots. Names, events, connections. It was as if I were designing a factory again. But instead of bricks, I was laying out people and their weaknesses. Everyone who had once turned away, whom I had fed and paid for with career opportunities, turned out to be a soft thread in a spider's web. Their ambitions, their secrets, their fears. All of this lay on paper, like solid statistics, ready to be used. What was born in me that night was not revenge in the usual sense. I will not seek fists or blades. My craft is not the destruction of bodies. My craft is the destruction of images. I know how the human brain works, how it loves order, how it fears chaos, how one little worry can ruin a picture of a whole life. I remembered how I had once built deals, how I had bribed time, how I had created doubt where there was no doubt. And I decided I would take them at their weakest point, at the illusion of control, at their pride, at what they had neglected. I began to observe carefully. Who leaves at 8? Who forgets to turn off the phone? Who is afraid of publicity? And who is afraid of scandals? My house had become a center of silent control. I did not have the tools of a young criminal. I had old connections that stretched back to the days when I gave orders and people obeyed. There were acquaintances who knew how to gently pressure or eavesdrop. There were facts that lay in archives, and I knew where these archives lay. But most of all, I had memory and patience. When I went to bed that night, the first moves were already spinning in my head. They seemed simple, almost nothing. A small slip of the tongue, a sudden phone call, a strange public statement. No one to kill. No one to humiliate physically. To destroy means to force one to look in the mirror and see oneself, but as someone else. I wanted them to feel what I felt in the underpass. How hard it is to rise when indifference sits in one's heart. But not randomly, but point by point. When their solid buildings suddenly collapse under their own weight, and they don't know who pushed the last brick. And I realized, I am no longer just an old man. I am a silent plan growing like intelligence. And in this game, victory is not a cry of renewal. Victory is the return of the weight of my word. I will not ask to return my place. I will take it. Victory is the return of the weight of my word. I will not ask for my place back. I will take it. Victory is the return of the weight of my word. I will not ask for my place back. I will take it. I remember this day as clearly as the date of my children's birth. The sun was thin, as if it too was afraid of the world that despises old age. I left the house with the same notebook in my inner pocket. It had already become more than a memory to me. A tool, a list, a plan. My gait was slow, but even a director never shows nervous crafts. People, of course, looked through me. It's already familiar. I decided not to act impulsively, not emotionally. My revenge is not a scandal, not a scolding in the market. My revenge is the restoration of the truth, carried out subtly and imperceptibly. When people say, he's not the same anymore, I will answer, he knows how to wait. The first evening I made several calls, old numbers that have survived in my memory. One, to a lawyer who once helped me with a tax case. Another to a bank employee who ignored my company's request when I could have paid the debt. I don't know if they remember me the same way I remember them, but their voices answered without any unnecessary questions. Experience is magic. I didn't want physical pain. No, my weapons were much more subtle. Information, context, the juxtaposition of events in time. People are afraid of being exposed, not for sins, but for hypocrisy. I knew this because I myself had learned to play that way. The first move was to work with documents. I conditionally remind the bank of an old contract that, in their opinion, had long since lost its force. I sent them, in a way that resembled a mistake, copies of the promises that my son had signed in his youth, the same papers that we had once concluded when his journey began. The banking department reviewed them anew. The first calls were to Stas headquarters. He didn't understand what had happened. It was a technical error. He would tell his friends on the phone, but the recordings left traces. I remembered the courts and arbitrations, and how one mistake once cost millions. I had not accidentally pulled the thread where the seams were the thinnest. The second move was my ex-partner's sister, who now headed a public organization responsible for a project on which the future of several people in the city depended. I sent anonymous letters summarizing her volunteer activities from a different perspective, with figures that differed from the official reports. This was not a reason for prison. It was a seed of doubt in the hearts of people who respected her. My son began to get nervous. There was less peace in his connection with him every time. The letters that appeared in his mailbox looked like random informative messages. Check the status of the contract. Review the report again. But in a pile they painted a picture of negligence. His confidence, the one that had once been his armor, was cracking. I recorded everything in a notebook: dates, names, reactions, and turned them into silent knives that cut through reputations sharper than a scream. Granddaughter Lilia, who laughed in my presence and forgot about politeness at home, received an erroneous message about a withdrawal from her mother's card. It was a small chaos. Calls, checks, moments of panic. I wasn't there to watch, but a piece of her armor cracked. Nikita, the one who used to joke in the hallway, found himself at the center of a school investigation. One of his jokes backfired when someone sent a teacher a saved chat history. I didn't do anything physically, just open the windows and let the wind do its thing. I always kept my distance. Not a word, not a trace pointing to me. Just cold, precise chains of coincidences. And people started to argue. Stas made a scene at a meeting when the bank asked for an explanation. He shouted, and I remembered how he had learned to speak no longer as a son but as a boss. Now his voice was breaking. At night he would call his mother, looking for support in her, or for something that was no longer there. They would argue so much that I could hear it in the wall because old houses listen. My tactic was not to destroy, but to open their eyes. I wanted them to see themselves in the reflection that had previously been there only for me. And I always left them a chance, a shadow to pass through the crack and correct their step. But they chose pride. Each action was like a chess move, imperceptible but leading to checkmate. And when, under that mask of chance and chaos, pictures began to form, I could feel something relaxing in my chest. This is not joy. This is the peace of a person who knows that the game ends correctly. They thought they had despised me forever, but I was like an old tree, silent for years, and when the roots activated their plan, it broke the paths. My revenge was not aimed at destroying, only at teaching. I did not want them to die. I wanted each of them to experience the small catastrophe that I once experienced. The first results were unimpressive, but poisonous. The family's relationships fell apart like a cardboard box in water. They soaked and disappeared. Stas lost a client because of carelessly submitted documentation. Because of this, the campaign he was proud of was under threat of inspection. He began to call me less often, not because he did not want to, but because he was ashamed. Lilia cried in her room, not knowing who worked with whom with the data of her bank transaction. Nikita was reprimanded at school. His mother hid his phone for a week, and there he saw how empty his life was. I focused not only on my family. People who had once despised me at work began to feel the pressure. A partner who had rejected my project years ago discovered that his own documents were flawed. A community council chair who had once let someone humiliate me received chilly letters from investors who questioned the organization's integrity. In small steps, I changed the context, and the context changed people. It was similar to the way I used to break down a negotiating opponent, not through force but through precision. I would hold them up to a mirror and push them so that they would see themselves for who they really were. Small, empty, hypocritical. In those days, I would often sit in the dark and look at a list in my notebook. I would note what had been done, what had worked, what emotions had come out. I did not enjoy their pain. Enjoyment is the word of the young. I felt professional. My revenge was a job that demanded precision, like clockwork. One morning my son arrived without warning. His face was bruised, not physically but mentally. He stood in the doorway, and his first words were, "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at him and saw the crown fall from his head. He looked like a young man reaching for his father's hand. I felt a pang. The pain had passed. Not in me, but in them. I refused to take immediate revenge. My goal was not revenge for revenge's sake, but to teach respect. I offered to help, but not in the way I had before. Not with my money, not with my authority. I gave him a list of contacts who could help sort out the paperwork. And there was no triumph in my voice. I realized that sometimes learning comes not through destruction, but through the opportunity to right a wrong you helped create. The family began to pick up the pieces. But it wasn't the same as before. Something had changed between us. They no longer looked at me as the old wonder object. A tinge of respect appeared in Stas's eyes, but it was earned through pain. I knew that their love now had a price. it was learned. I, in turn, had changed differently. Revenge had taught me cold wisdom. I had learned not to forgive as my nature had once been forgiving. I had learned not to forget. The days had become less empty. When my neighbors passed by now, they no longer looked through me with the same casualness. I felt I had gained a different kind of freedom. Freedom from having to prove my worth to myself. I was not captivated by the recognition or the fear in their eyes. I was interested in the truth that was revealed. My story is not about triumph or joy or pleasure. It is about a lesson I decided to teach slowly, with the precision of a watchmaker. As things began to calm down, and I saw that the consequences of my actions did lead to change, I realized one thing. Respect is not something you buy with money or something you shout for. It is something that grows out of mutual effort, or is born out of pain that forces people to look inward. The children came more often. They learned to listen. The grandchildren finally sat next to me and asked about the years I had lived. They didn't always want to listen, but now, having had to face the consequences of their own indifference, their ears were different. It's a sad way to learn, but sometimes life's lessons are like that. The society that had laughed in transition now held its breath as it met me. Not scared, but with the respect that came with a different consciousness. Old age can be a strength. I do not want my name on the covers of newspapers. I do not seek fame. I only admit that my sense of dignity has returned. I look in the mirror and see not only wrinkles. I see a man who knows how to stand in his silence and do what is necessary. I see a person who is learning not to forgive foolishly, but also not to destroy unnecessarily. My revenge was a lesson for others and for myself. You can learn to respect through pain, but better through understanding. Sometimes at night, when the house breathes quietly, I look through the notebook. There are dry notes, dates, names. I know that the pain I unleashed hurt not only them, but me too. Because in every touch of revenge there was a piece of me, the same one that once held our home on my shoulders. The lesson told me not to kill, but to nurture. And perhaps this is the biggest change. I learned that dignity requires struggle, but struggle does not always have to be destructive. Once I was a source of strength for my family. Now I am a different force. Calm, cold, but wise. I have learned to stand silently and make my move. And although no one applauds me, I feel inner peace. People no longer despise me so easily. They have learned to count. And this is the reward for an old man who has given much to the world, and who has finally made the world respect him, at least in a small way. My lesson ended not with a shout, but with a quiet truth. Old age is not a sentence, but a strength. And no one can take away the right to dignity unless you yourself allow it.